Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, and experience from hundreds, no, thousands of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm going to have a conversation with Thomas Schindler. Thomas, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Fritz, for having me. I'm excited and I feel honored to be one of your guests here on this show.
Thomas, let me briefly introduce you to our audience. You are German born in California, then you moved back to Europe, and you're currently living between Costa Rica and Germany.
That's correct. Yeah.
You have dedicated your professional life and energy towards using technology to contribute to making the planet a good place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my preparation, I've seen that you've founded numerous companies, and the latest being Delodi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, which supports clients and product development in business model innovation process. So that is what I found on the internet. What did I miss? When you introduce yourself, how would you introduce yourself?
I like starting at the foundation, which is more or less dinner table conversations around when I was little, right? And my brother, my sister, and I were little, around the questions of existential threat for humanity and how natural science could contribute to solving those or mitigating those. And that was held by our parents, who were both natural scientists, and my father was one of the people defining the field of biophysics sometime in the 70s, and we had numerous international scientists, very up to Nobel laureates around the dinner table at points where we engage in that conversation. And this instilled two things in me. One, it is really helpful to think from first principles if you really want to understand and then have an effect. And there's a lot of effect to be had because we're in a very difficult predicament as humanity at this point, right? So that's where I'd like to start as a foundation. This is what defines me most, I think, apart from deep love for life, for my family, for and a tremendous hope that we can actually build a beautiful world.
When you talk about this is how you grew up with, was that each evening at the dinner table, or was it the occasional Saturday evening?
To be realistic, it probably wasn't every night. I mean, we had school issues to discuss and things like that, of course, as well. But it was very dominant. It was the carrying theme of our family, really, that for sure.
But nevertheless, what you described, you allude to a very fascinating period. That I mean, what you mentioned, having all these great scientists, including Nobel laureates, at your dinner table. Everybody has that experience. Has that exposure?
No, of course, we're incredibly privileged and lucky to have had that, and also to have had the foundation that allows us to explore. I mean, when I say us, my brother, my sister, and I, but to explore ways of contributing to this situation, right? So my first attempt was, which was very far removed from what my parents were about, was to go into business and see if I can contribute from that side, because I thought as a pragmatic solution to solving real world issues if the incentive is aligned, right? And I was wondering, how can we align incentive? And I was noticing that money seemed to be flowing in the wrong direction in all of this. Right? The money being the fuel of the entire economic layer. I was wondering, how can I change that, and how can I understand that from a deep root? And this is maybe just one example of what I mean by first principle thinking and systemic changes. When I happened to be in a meeting in 2003 with Ernst Welteke and Bernard Lietaer. Ernst Welteke had been the head of the Central Bank of Germany, or was at that moment still. And Bernard was the head of the Central Bank in Belgium before he became the chief architect of the euro. And the two wanted to create a new currency somewhere in Germany. And I was there because I had a software company. I started building software platforms and companies in the 90s. And so at a software company that was supposed to build a platform for their efforts. And I just couldn't understand how these two high finance dudes could come up with a new currency out of thin air. And then Bernard was so kind to explain to me how money actually works and what the design of your money yields in emergences in the social, cultural, environmental, etc. fields that you have to be aware of and be careful about when you design your currency. Right? That was the first real deep epiphany that I've had.
I want to come back to something you said earlier, maybe also something you discussed with the people you just mentioned, the fact that money's flowing in the wrong direction. Could you clarify that?
Yeah. So my first idea about how to contribute was by actually going out in the world and helping people who are in misery. And what I could see around me was that social work would potentially do that. Right? So I studied social work. That was my first thing, because I thought with this I can tangibly, literally help people. Now, what I understood while doing that was two things. One, I'm just a maintainer of the system. I'm helping those people live a life, but I'm not helping them thrive and flourish, because that's not what's part of the whole setup of social work. But I could also see, and as part of that, really, that there was small amounts of money needed for people to get them out of their traps that they found themselves in, or that they had gotten themselves into and wanted to get out, but they needed a little bit of money to help them get started. That money wasn't arriving. And I was speaking with educators. They were also telling me, the money's not arriving here. But at the same time, I could see money arriving in other places where I thought, okay, there's enough money over there accumulating. Was the moment where startups and the web started kicking off, so there was a lot of money flowing into that direction. But generally, I'm talking about the economic sphere, right? There's a lot of accumulation happening there, and none of that is flowing to serve the people and the planet in any way. That's what I saw. That's what I mean by money flowing in the wrong direction.
Okay. You've already implied that. What is then the definition of money flowing in the right direction from your context?
From my context, I would say, let's step even further out from that. Why should we even, so what does money do for us? And think from that perspective so that we can reframe how much of that we need, what it should look like, what do we need it for? I'd like to ground this in a little story and a big dream that Bernard had. And so that ultimately is an important element of what we're doing right now. The work we're doing right now is really tied to that story. So Bernard was called in by the Belgian government once to help them solving an issue in the city of Ghent. The issue was that there were undocumented people living in a part of town, and because of that, they didn't have jobs, they didn't have money. There was this whole downward spiral of substance abuse, violence, desolation going on, and nobody had an idea how to get them out of this. So at one point, for some reason, they called Bernard. Bernard went in. He asked them, "What's your dream?" All the people living there. And it seemed to be that the predominant dream was to have a little piece of land to grow something. And so he made that dream possible by organizing a piece of land from the city and creating a currency that you could earn by doing nice things in the neighborhood, literally being nice to your neighbors, putting flowers in the windows, cleaning the street, all of that. And only with that currency could you rent a piece of land. Now he aligned the incentive structure. And because if the environment starts being positive, people start pulling themselves out of their trap, right? And that's been proven all over again and again. Environment dictates behavior a lot. So that's worked. Other cities copied it. Now, what Bernard took from that was that he wanted to create a central bank of dreams. So you deposit the Fritz dream in that central bank, and Thomas goes about his stuff in the world somewhere and happens to increase Fritz dream, right? Now, what happens is, because your backing increases, you create Fritz token, and I get some, right? Because I contributed. Can I buy anything with that? Not really, right? Because who would accept Fritz token, right? Unless we have an elaborate scheme of transactions and blah, blah, blah. But as a thought experiment, let's think this through. If everybody is in the business of fulfilling their and other people's dreams in the process, maybe what's left to do is clean the toilet, right? Because if you will always find somebody who would love to put clothes on you, who would love to nurture you with food or in an emotional or other way. Somebody wants to put a roof on over you, right? Somebody who loves designing houses, and somebody even who loves building them. Now, the only real issue with this is material. Right? The reason why this is hard to imagine, and this is also why I couldn't really follow Bernard for a long time. It clicked for me a couple of years ago only. When I discovered maybe there's a different way to think about material. Right? Maybe there's a way that we can think about material that is aligned with this, where if we had the material, right, people could start engaging in each other's dreams. So how does that work? Well, we all know that. I would call it the most successful economy on this planet. And we call it nature. And nature knows how to use the 172,000 terawatt coming from the big fusion reactor in the sky, we usually call sun, to recycle the same 6 atoms again and again. So the dinosaur you once were and the flower you are going to be, all the same stuff, right? Now, if you have eyes and teeth and bones and run on electricity, there's hardly any material imaginable that you would need in your life that you cannot grow in natural processes, right? And if you look at indigenous knowing and cutting edge science, both, you will discover that that whole platform exists at different levels of distribution, at different levels of implementability at this point, right? But it's there. We can take this and literally build an entirely new set of level of infrastructure on this, right? And now, just to round this up, and then I'll leave some space again. But this is an enormous opportunity. Right now, we're creating 19 terawatts by burning rotten algae, and turn that into 100 billion tons of material every year, while also creating 40 billion tons of waste and pollution every year. That's what humans do, right? Enormous ratio from taking 19 terawatt of energy into 150 billion tons of material, right? Some of it good, some of it not. Now take nature. Nature uses 172,000 terawatts to create 140 billion ton economy per year. So 140 billion tons of organic matter is being created every year without any waste. Now, what if we only tapped in 1% of our ingenuity of transforming energy into materiality to those processes? only 1% would lead to a 9-fold increase in material abundance. Imagine that world.
I just need a couple of seconds to start to think about that, Thomas, and I'll also leave that to the audience to think about that. And this dream, this vision you just described, is that also what you then take with you in your day-to-day work, in all the various companies you have set up? And by the way, is there a thread, a common theme in all those companies?
Absolutely. So you mentioned Delody. Delody is a small software boutique that my business partner, who's also called Thomas, and I set up many years ago, 12 or so years ago, 13 years ago. And the purpose of this organization is to provide us with the set of resources we need to contribute to a life-serving world in a way that's where nobody would give us money for things, so we can do this ourselves. So this is why this company exists. We even put it into the name. So the sweet-sounding Delody is actually a short of deliver or die, right? And it is a reminder of us that we don't have this company for our own optimization, for our own financial optimization or anything, but we have this money as this company as a platform to allow us to do the things we want to do, right? So that big picture that I just described about how to start to envision a new way of doing things as civilization, that we call this the heliogenic civilization, right? The civilization that is running literally on sunlight. And it has enormous effects on governance and all of that, right? So, but that's our dream. That's where we want to take it. Now we see 3 main lever points to actually start making that happen. And we're providing pieces of infrastructure in forms of non-profit organizations along these vectors. So the vectors are coordination. With coordination, we mean that if the 98% of us all, 8 billion of us, got together and talked about what is it actually about, we would very likely be in strong agreement, right? 98% because these are the people without any meaningful resources. So if we got together and said, well, what's this about? What would likely happen is that the 300,000 years of being human would be somewhat stronger than the 300 years of industrialization, right? So that would come to surface. And there's a lot going on in there. We have a political nonprofit in Germany. We have a educational nonprofit helping people think this through for themselves and find alignment, etc. All of these things. The next one, obviously, is materiality, right? How can we make sure that the processes of using natural processes become known and usable anywhere in the world, right? So, for example, we're organizing funding for startups in that sector, but we're engaging in activity around exiting them to planets, so exiting them to the commons, so that they become a part of the globally owned infrastructure by everybody that is life-serving. Right? So that's the vector of materiality, and there's much more going on, but I'm just going to highlight this one. And the third one, I think, might be even the most important. Because what we found is that in the current situation of civilization globally, we are entrapped. So even if we see what's going on, it's really, really hard to move out of that. It's a multipolar trap that holds us in place because it comes with an enormous first mover disadvantage. If you move out of that, you will likely lose out big time as a country, as an individual, as a company, whatever. And so nobody's doing it. Everybody's waiting for everybody else to move. And so we're trying to think full Buckminster Fuller on this and say, what if we could create a system outside of the current system that is a much more attractive alternative? Now, who should that attract? We're saying it should attract those people who are not yet really part of that first trap. which are 42% of the global population who are under 25 years of age, right? So those who are not yet captured and those who are already liberated, who want to live a life in a different way, we're providing them with the material needs and the coordination to live into a heliogenic civilization. So that's what we're doing. And then there's a structure that pulls all of that together. That is right now in the beginning. It's called Miracle Factory Network. And what we do there is we build physical spaces that you can think of like universities that help bioregions heal themselves and publish the knowledge they learn into a shared knowledge pool that is organized by a large language model for everybody to tap in and understand what they can use of that for their specific purpose. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing.
That's systemic change for you. If you are you when you think about this and your final picture, are you thinking in years or are you thinking in generations to achieve your goal?
Both. And I ground that in an idea called the Stockdale paradox, which not many people know. So I'm going to briefly explain it. There was an admiral of the US Navy who was captured in the Vietnam War. He was in a North Vietnamese prison camp for 8 years, and he discovered, not so surprisingly, that the pessimists among his co-prisoners didn't really make it through. And then, to a little bit more of a surprise, he discovered that the optimists also didn't make it through, because optimists tend to become pessimists once they have been disappointed often enough. Mm-hmm. The people who made it through intact were the ones who were able to hold both ruthless short-term realism and radical long-term optimism, right? So if I apply that to your question, I would say we're really in deep trouble right now, from any perspective imaginable, from cultural, political, geopolitical, material, energy, economic, any dimension you look at is in deep shit, right? And this is a dangerous situation because that creates a lot of friction, and we often resolve friction with more friction, and that's a danger, right? So we need to be really, really fast. So what we're doing comes with great urgency. We're trying to do this as fast as humanly possible, and I see a time horizon of roughly 5 years where we have sufficient traction where people can actually start living and flourishing this, right? We're prototyping this, by the way, right now in Oroville in India. And also we're building the first miracle factory in Costa Rica, and there are numerous places in between. So that's one. That's the short term. The long term, I think, is going to take generations, right? Although there's mycelial compute happening in science labs, although there's enzyme and DNA-based compute happening in science labs in the world, the organic compute is not at a point where you can grow your phone in the garden, right? But ultimately, that's where we should be going, right? And that's also what's ultimately possible, that you have the possibility of creating your communication infrastructure that allows us now here to have this conversation, everybody to listen to this. We want to keep that. It's beautiful, right? I don't want us to go back into a world where we only live in our local little village in our bioregion, but where we also have the ability to connect with everybody else on the planet, because that's where this enormous capacity for innovation of humans begins to flourish to its fullest.
Okay. Okay. Short term, long term. Thank you for that answer. What you described for me sounds like science fiction. Okay, I'm going to grow my mobile phone. I like that, yeah. But I like that vision. But can you give us some examples of, I would say, more real world examples of where Heliogenicis is working already, that people see, look, there is something out there which shows you we can do this.
Okay. I think housing is a big thing, right? So 1.5 billion people will likely lose their homes due to climate disruptions in the next 30 years. So people will need a lot of homes. And so let's look at that. The first step is pretty easy. There's a beautiful design principle called Earthship, which I'm going to use for this example, which basically says, let's use physics principles as much as possible. The first step is to create a lot of thermal mass, Earth. You can use Earth, local Earth for this, and build basically 3 walls. It's a long house, and it's directed towards the sun. And so a lot of thermal mass keeps the temperature. And you have some pipes going through the back for cool air ventilation. And then you add 2 large sheets of glass in the front that allow the sunlight to come in, heat up the first segment, which can be used as a greenhouse and to recycle your gray water into your tomatoes, and have it act as a buffer zone for the part behind this, right? All sounds beautiful so far, because much of this you can build with local materials easily and with your friends. Now, where it becomes a problem is with the glass. Right now, we're used to having glass in the form of the extract of silicate-rich sand. So somewhere in the world, we dig a hole, get out the sand, use a lot of fossil fuels in the process, shift it somewhere else where we can use it with fossil fuels, where we can burn a lot of fossil fuels to melt it, bring it again across the planet to melt it again to turn it into a product that is then delivered to your door with fossil fuels again. So that's the entire chain of your window. Now, we're working with a scientist. Her name's Anne Meyer. She's absolutely amazing, and she is working on all sorts of materials. And one of them is using enzymes to grow glass in silicate-rich water. Now, that's how shells are created, right? She's using the process of shell creation, basically. So if you have an E. coli bacteria, that'll use the silicate in the water to create a shell around itself, which is currently actually being used as a lens for increasing the efficiency of solar panels. But if you have a scaffold along which those little bubbles of glass can grow, you get a sheet of glass.
Wow.
No transport, no need for fossil fuels, sunlight and nature. That's it. And that's one way. Another way, which is a lost art in a way, which is also run by a lady, Ella Einhell. She, in Germany, uses the enormous amounts of bones from the meat industry that are waste to turn those into glass. This is old knowledge, right? This is not cutting edge science. So this is to highlight both ends, right? We can use cutting edge science, but we can also use indigenous knowing. And I'm pretty sure there are many other ways to do this. But there is a process of turning bones into glass. This is more milky. This is not completely see-through, but it still is glass. It does the thing that you expect from glass. So that's a concrete example.
Well, it's good that you're able to share those concrete examples to convince those skeptics, hey, there is something out there. Have a look at that. as mentioned, short-term, long-term perspective to get
Mm.
the actually generated world
Mhm.
organized. How would you define success in the meantime? How would you go about looking at milestones to make certain, hey, we're
Mhm. Mhm.
getting there? How would they look like?
Mhm. Okay. Um, I'm I'm just going to share the trajectory of what we hope we are going to do with the Miracle Factory network in the next couple of years. But this by no means that we're the only ones and the only ones who are right. We do, but there are many others doing something very similar towards something very similar. So also our idea of the heliogenic civilization is not surprising if you think about it, right? So I know many people will see similar futures in different words. Now, milestones. End of next year, construction is going to begin in Costa Rica, Miracle Factory Punta Sol. In the meantime, we will start the construction of a small example in India. And there's a second place in Costa Rica where we will, that's already built that we will be part of. We're not going to run the whole thing, but we'll be part of. This constitutes the first layer on which one of the important ingredients, as you remember, is Delody. Delody provides resources to build an AI infrastructure on top of this, to start piloting how can we integrate all of the knowledge that comes out of these places into one large language model that then allows somebody, and there are some prototypical communities in the world that we're in contact with that will start using this um, for their good. So they find solutions appropriate to their bioregion and to their situation. So building milestone one, the real infrastructure. Milestone two, building the first level of software on top of this. But then it becomes really interesting because right now we have access to several presidents of what we call frontline nations. Frontline nations is our term for describing those countries that are going to be hit by the situation hardest and earliest. And we're going to sit down groups of young people with the blueprints that comes out of the process of Costa Rica, which is co-created by young people all over the planet. And this is also an invitation. Anybody who listens to this and feels pulled, please reach out and sit them down with the president and say, shouldn't we be doing this here too? And so we see a whole other layer of self-propelled miracle factories emerging. And then as a third one, we're integrating existing organizations, right? So if people are interested in regeneration, you probably have heard of people like Joe Brewer or Daniel Wall, who are doing amazing work in that field. And their work and their knowledge is absolutely valuable and should also become part of this. So they can become part of the Miracle Factory network with this, right? So that's, from our perspective, the final milestone, because then we have a enormous global data source into a strong AI layer that is usable by anybody on the planet because it's held in the commons. And we're, of course, building infrastructure to ensure that this stays that way.
Wow. Thomas, lot to do. Unfortunately, we're over time for this small talk we're having right now. We will make sure that we include links that people will be able to find you and the initiative you're working on if they're
That sounds
interested.
amazing.
Before you go away, what would your advice be to young people out there who might want to be interested in getting involved?
Mm-hmm. So I have the sense that when I was 16 or 17, I could see very clearly what was wrong and what needed to be done to get it right. But I did not have the experience or the resources to get my concern met, meaning my influence of my circle of influence was much, much smaller, and my circle of experience was much, much smaller. And it took me a long time to get back to that state of clarity. So it's basically the clarity or the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So my advice would be to trust that what you know deep inside of yourself is true, is actually true. And know that there are other people out there who see this, and try to find those people and get experience, get resources, get connection, weave webs with other people who are seeing the same thing as you do, so you can make it a reality. That would be my advice.
Good advice, Thomas. Thomas Schindler, thank you so much for sharing the story of the work you're doing. Fascinating. You've described a very interesting future, and hopefully one day we'll get there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fritz. Thank you for inviting me and taking the time to have this slightly outrageous conversation. I just want to say one last thing. For those who are skeptical about this, please search for Winston Churchill's essay called 50 Years Hence. He wrote that in 1932, and it might even sound stranger than what I talked about today. But many of those things he describes in there in weird images, in some form, actually have been created since. So sometimes weird stuff might just happen. Thank you.
Again, Thomas, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.